Hi everyone, welcome to the Lab 8 presentation on plate tectonics. Plate tectonics is a really cool topic. That's not just learning, we're not just learning about the surface of the Earth, we're learning about what's underneath it as well. Basically, the Earth is a sphere that everything we know about the surface, our entire lives, everything concerned with humans happens on the crust of the Earth, which is a very thin layer around the outside. And there are some molten areas underneath, but for the most part, Earth is mostly solid. It's Here are a few videos that you can watch on your own. I think they're really informative. They'll help you get some more context for these sorts of things. But the Earth basically is made up of concentric layers stacked up on top of each other. If you were to take a cross section like this, you take a pie wedge shape out of the Earth, and you would see the solid inner core, outer core, which is molten, and which comprises most of the volume of the Earth is the mantle. The mantle can flow somewhat. There are some parts of the mantle that may be hotter or subject to less pressures or more pressures than other areas, and they might be molten. They would flow like semi-liquid. But for most of the mantle, it's actually solid. Given enough pressure, sometimes the semi-fluid rock is able to flow somewhat, which is what allows these different plates based on the plate tectonics theory to move about on the surface. So the crust is not uniform. It's not uniform in its thickness. It's not uniform in its composition. It's highly variable. But for the most part, you can think about the crust as being continental or oceanic. Oceanic crust is very thin relative to continental crust, which could be up to 60 miles thick. Continental crust basically makes up everything that most of the land that humans live on. And it's primarily made of felsic materials. This is referring to like the bedrock that the continental crust is actually made up of. Not so much near the surface, but talking deep down. It's might be represented by granite, would be a good example of a typical continental crust rock, versus oceanic crust, which is oftentimes a heavier rock, oftentimes basalt. It's very dark. And the mantle varies somewhat. I won't get into that really, but you can find a lot more info about this in your textbook, the chapter on plate tectonics. So the different types of crust, the continental and oceanic, basically sit on top, or you might think of they might float on top of the uppermost mantle. And there's this term called the asthenosphere, which is basically the semi-fluid rock which is able to flow somewhat under pressures, which is what everything sits on top of and moves on top of. So the lithosphere is strong. Asthenosphere, actually, the word actually means that it's less strong. It's not strong. It's weaker. It's more easily to be flowing. So it's able to move, deform. We're going to do, there's a required at-home mini experiment. Basically, you take peanut butter and crackers. You could also use frosting instead of peanut butter, or something that's tacky, semi-liquids. That's something that's you're able to spread. Yogurt might work. And you put a layer down of that peanut butter or whatever, and you put the crackers on top, and the crackers would represent the crust of the Earth. They might represent different tectonic plates. If you were to put two crackers down next to each other and then you squish them together, that's basically what would happen with these plates, these tectonic plates. And they sit on that semi-fluid surface underneath, layer underneath. So the peanut butter might represent the asthenosphere. Okay. And so another more differences between the oceanic crust and continental. So I've already said that you can think of these plates, these tectonic plates, as floating on top of this semi-liquid layer underneath. And if you think about it, in terms of a floating block of wood or floating styrofoam, whatever, the thicker the piece of floating wood there is, the higher it's going to sit up out of the water. This diagram taken from the textbook shows it pretty well. This explains why continental crust is higher up in elevation. We have why there isn't water, because water is sitting on top of the very thin oceanic crust. If you've learned about plate tectonics in the past, I'm sure you've heard about the original theory of continental drift. This is where it all started. Scientists know so much more today related to plate tectonic theory, but it started with this, just with this Alfred Wegener figuring out that the continents seem to sort of fit together. They have very similar shapes, which is not a coincidence. At one time in the past, hundreds of millions of years ago, continents were together to form Pangaea. There were also other continents throughout the eons, but Pangaea is the famous one. In lab today, there's actually a little free online tool that you can it's basically an online puzzle. You rotate the continents so that they roughly fit together. And they fit together in such a way that different parts of the present day continents would match up. So basically, mountain ranges match up with other mountain ranges on other continents. Fossil records also support this. You can find similar fossils on continents that are so far apart because back when the animals were alive, they were not far apart. They were connected. There are also rock and core samples. There's polarity of magnetic rocks that you can look at too that also supports this. So it's very well understood at this point. These core samples, basically, if you were to go underneath the ocean, there are these oceanic trenches where tectonic plates are moving apart from each other. That is a divergent boundary. Basically, the crust moves apart and liquid rock comes up and it cools and forms new rock. So rock is older the further away from these trenches that you get. And if you take core samples further and further away from these undersea trenches, you find data that supports this theory. There's also the polarity. Throughout history, sometimes the Earth's magnetic field will flip, it will reverse. So the magnetic north would actually be in the geographic south and vice versa. And you can find these periods of time where the poles would reverse, and this is seen in magnetic rock on the ocean floor. This could also be on anywhere there's a divergent plate boundary. These plate boundaries, this map shows it pretty well. In lab today, you're actually going to use Google Earth to look at these plate boundaries. You're able to click on them. It's interactive. It's better than just a static map. But you can see that the red lines here are convergent. Yellow is divergent. Divergent is when plates are moving away from each other. Convergent is when they converge or they come together. So when divergent is, I think, pretty self-explanatory. There's plates are moving away from each other. But on convergent boundaries, it's a few different things can happen. Depends on the kind of crust that you have. If you have two oceanic crusts converging, then one might not always go over the other. They might push together, both go up. Versus if you have a oceanic plate combining with a continental plate, excuse me, when they converge or come together, the oceanic plate, because it's so thin and it's so much lower, just naturally wants to go underneath or subduct under the continental plate. So that is a really unique and very important, with huge implications, plate boundary, because uh, take a look at where some of these convergent plate boundaries are along the west coast of South America, along the west coast of North America, and all throughout the Ring of Fire in Southeast Asia. And these are these subduction zones where there's a plate converging on another plate, and the oceanic plate subducting underneath the continental. This is really important because it makes a ton of earthquakes, produces lots of volcanoes. It's a highly active site. It's a highly active plate boundary. So convergent boundaries are really unique, especially with the subduction zones. There can be a lot going on there. And transform, the third type of plate boundary, often called a slip strike fault too, is basically plates moving side to side of one another. That produces a ton of earthquakes, not usually volcanoes, however, um, but they can be highly active to form earthquakes. The most famous one would be the San Andreas Fault, which is a transform boundary, which is two plates moving side to side. It can build up a lot of stress in the rock, in the tectonic plates themselves. And then when stress and pressure becomes so great, then that's released, and rocks might crack or they shift against one another, and there's so much weight and force involved, it produces huge earthquakes. There might, not every earthquake may be huge, however. There could be very small, minor earthquakes happening all the time. It's all very dependent on the location. Each plate boundary is a little unique to any others, and geologists have been studying this extensively. So here again is showing you divergent plate boundaries. It's basically seafloor spreading. There are a few places where divergent boundaries actually happen on land, such as in Iceland. But most of the time, these divergent boundaries are on the ocean floor. Already talked about convergent boundaries, and that depends, what type of convergent boundary you're going to have on whether it's ocean crust or ocean continent crust, etc. And transform boundaries, remember, that's just slipping side to side of one another. They often have this distinct shape with 90-degree angles from one another. So that's very indicative of divergent boundaries and transform boundaries occurring together. They're both forming around the same place. So the San Andreas Fault is one of the most famous here in the United States because it produces a ton of earthquakes. They made a movie about it, a few movies about it. And that's basically when the Juan de Fuca plate is subducting underneath the North American plate, but it has this fault line, this transform boundary that goes all the way south to Mexico. And that's just rocks sliding against other rock. Produces a ton of earthquakes. It's highly active. I'm not going to show this video in this presentation, but I encourage you to check it out. I'll post the slides online. That's a canvas. This video is showing you the divergent boundary in Iceland, that you can actually go see where the fault does happen to line up. There are places where the fault is very spread out, but sometimes it forms cracks that you can dive into. Now, we're going to ask you about some locations and what tectonic plate those locations would be on. Just wanted to show you the Arabian plate, that one, so you're going to find that better. I think it's pretty easy with Google Earth. However, you're able to search in locations, and uh, just remember to have that KML file downloaded from Canvas so that you can re-upload it to Google Earth. And this lab is going to be one of the longer, most interactive, I would say, labs. There's three sections being the puzzle, online puzzle that you can find in link to in the lab document, Google Earth project, and then the at-home mini experiment using peanut butter and crackers. So this lab is a little atypical compared to the others, but there's no graphing, so that will be a relief to some of you. And as always, if you have any questions about this material, or you want to see if your graham crackers and peanut butter looks the way it should, you can always just shoot me an email. I'll get back to you as quickly as I can.